The piano keys were wet with tears, but Paul McCartney couldn't stop playing. It was 3:47 a.m. on January 15th, 1982, exactly 13 months since John Lennon's death, and Paul was finally ready to have the conversation he'd been avoiding for over a year. Not a real conversation. John was gone forever, but a musical one. A song that would say everything Paul had never found the courage to tell his former partner while he was alive. What happened in Paul's home studio that night would result in Here Today, one of the most emotionally devastating songs ever recorded. But the story of how Paul wrote it, the breakdown, the guilt, the imaginary conversations with John's ghost, was so personal that Paul sealed the original recording session tapes and swore never to speak about them publicly. When those tapes were discovered in Paul's archive in 2019, they revealed a man so consumed with grief and regret that he spent 7 hours talking to an empty room, pleading with a dead friend for forgiveness. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most heartbreaking masterpieces, you need to hear this. Because sometimes the most important songs are written not for an audience, but for the people who will never hear them. Paul sat in his home studio, staring at blank sheet music. Linda had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from trying to comfort Paul through another sleepless night. The children were asleep upstairs, innocent of the torment their father carried every waking moment. Tomorrow would mark 13 months since John's death, and Paul still hadn't found a way to process the loss, the guilt, the 1,000 things he wished he'd said. The studio felt haunted. Every piece of equipment reminded Paul of sessions they'd shared, arguments they'd had, moments of pure creative magic that would never happen again. The Hufner bass in the corner was the same model he'd played on countless Beatles recordings. The piano bench where he sat had supported both their weights during late-night writing sessions, when they were young and fearless, and believed their partnership would last forever. Just write something, Paul whispered to himself, his voice hoarse from crying. Anything. Just start. But every time he put his hands on the piano keys, he heard John's voice in his head, not encouraging him, but challenging him. The way John always had when they wrote together. It was John's voice from their final years, sharp with cynicism and disappointment. What are you going to say, Paul? That you're sorry? That you miss me? Is that supposed to make up for everything we destroyed? Paul knew it was his own guilt speaking, not John's actual voice. But the imaginary conversations had been getting more frequent, more intense, especially as the anniversary approached. Sometimes Paul would find himself arguing with empty air, defending decisions he'd made decades ago to a man who would never hear his explanations. He'd tried writing tribute songs before. The Man had been an attempt, but it felt too abstract, too removed from the real John, the John who could be cruel and kind in the same breath, who challenged every musical choice Paul made, who pushed him to be better than he ever thought possible. Paul wanted to write something direct, something honest, something that acknowledged both the beauty and the devastating pain of their relationship. The weight of their unfinished business felt crushing. The last real conversation they'd had was in 1976, here in this very studio, when John had visited Sussex unexpectedly. They'd talked about music, about their children, about everything except the chasm that had opened between them. Paul had wanted to address their relationship directly, to somehow bridge the years of silence and resentment. But John had deflected every attempt with humor or sarcasm, and Paul had let him, too afraid of another confrontation, to push for the honesty they both needed. Now John was dead, and that conversation would never happen. All Paul had left were regrets and what-ifs, and the echo of a partnership that had defined his entire adult life. Paul finally placed his hands on the keys and played a simple chord progression, something gentle, conversational, like background music for an intimate talk. The melody came from somewhere deep in his muscle memory, a combination of every late-night writing session they'd ever shared. And then he started speaking, as if John were sitting beside him on the piano bench. "John, I know you can't hear me, but I need to talk to you. I need to tell you things I should have said years ago when you could still listen." Paul's voice cracked immediately. He'd been holding back tears for 13 months, trying to be strong for Linda, for the children, for the public who expected him to grieve gracefully and move on. But alone in his studio, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared creativity, he finally let himself break down completely. "I'm sorry, mate. I'm so fucking sorry for all of it. For the business fights, for the ego battles, for letting money and lawyers and other people's opinions come between us. For letting everything get so complicated when it used to be so simple." Paul started playing while he talked, letting the melody emerge naturally from his emotions. The chord progression was melancholy but hopeful, like a question waiting for an answer that would never come. His left hand found a bass line that echoed their old songwriting rhythm. Paul on piano, John on guitar, both voices weaving together in harmony. I keep thinking about that last day at Abbey Road, August 20th, 1969. You probably don't even remember the exact date, but I do. I remember everything about it. What you were wearing, how tired you looked, the way you avoided looking at me directly. I was trying so hard to hold us together, trying to pretend everything was normal, when we all knew it wasn't. The memories came flooding back as Paul played. John's increasing distance during those final sessions, the way he'd started bringing Yoko to every recording, the gradual realization that something irreplaceable was ending. Paul had fought so hard to save the Beatles that he'd lost sight of what made them special in the first place, the pure joy of making music together. "I should have listened to you when you said you needed a break. I should have supported your relationship with Yoko instead of seeing it as a threat. I should have been your friend instead of trying to be your manager, your keeper, I don't know what I thought I was trying to be." As Paul continued his one-sided conversation, a song began to emerge from his grief. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but the lyrics were devastating in their honesty. They captured not just his love for John, but his confusion about who John had really been. Beneath the public persona, the private jokes, the defensive sarcasm. "And if I said I really knew you well, what would your answer be?" Paul sang the lines softly, testing how they felt in his mouth. They captured something essential about their relationship, the way fame and business had created distance between them, the way they'd stopped really knowing each other as people and had become characters in each other's stories. "If you were here today, well, knowing you, you'd probably laugh and say that we were worlds apart." "That's exactly what you'd say, isn't it, John?" Paul said to the empty room, his voice breaking with exhaustion and longing. "You'd make some joke about how dramatic I'm being. You'd deflate the whole thing with sarcasm, and somehow that would make it better. You'd find a way to make me laugh, even while you were breaking my heart." Paul could almost hear John's voice responding, cutting through sentiment with that trademark wit. "Christ, Paul, you're making me sound like a saint. I was a bastard half the time, and you know it. A selfish, wounded bastard who took out his pain on everyone around him." "But you were my bastard," Paul whispered back to the imaginary presence. "You were my partner, my collaborator, my brother, really. And I let business and egos and other people's expectations destroy that. I let lawyers and accountants and music industry politics matter more than our friendship. The guilt was overwhelming. Paul had spent 13 months replaying every argument, every missed opportunity for reconciliation, every moment when pride had trumped love. The business disputes that had seemed so important at the time now felt trivial compared to what they'd lost. Klein, Northern Songs, Apple Corps, all of it meaningless now that John was gone. As the song developed, Paul's emotional state became increasingly fragile. He was essentially having a seance through songwriting, conjuring John's presence through melody and memory, trying to resurrect their creative partnership through sheer force of will and love. "I keep wondering if you forgive me," Paul told the imaginary John, his fingers finding familiar chord progressions that echoed their collaborative history. "For pushing too hard about getting back together. For those interviews where I said things. I said things that hurt you, and I can't take them back now. I was angry and defensive, and I spoke without thinking about how my words would land in your heart." Paul remembered a particularly painful Rolling Stone interview where he'd dismissed John's solo work as not his best. The comment had been born of hurt and jealousy, but it had been published worldwide, another wound in their already damaged relationship. Paul played through another verse, the melody growing more complex as his emotions deepened. "And if I said I really loved you, and was glad you came along. I did love you, John. I do love you. Not in any weird way, but as a creative partner, as someone who understood music the way I did, as someone who could take my half-formed ideas and transform them into something magical. You were my creative soulmate. You made me better. You made me braver. And I don't know how to make music without that conversation we used to have." The admission broke something open in Paul. He sobbed so hard he had to stop playing, his body shaking with 13 months of suppressed grief. The studio filled with the sound of his crying, raw, ugly, cathartic weeping that he'd been holding back since the moment he'd learned of John's death. "I can't do this without you," he cried to the empty room. "Everyone expects me to be fine, to keep making music like nothing happened. But half of my brain is missing. The half that challenged me, that pushed me to be better than I thought I could be. The half that would tell me when a song was shit and when it was brilliant, and somehow always knew the difference." In his grief-stricken state, exhausted from months of insomnia and guilt, Paul began to hear John's voice more clearly, as if his partner were actually responding to the song. Whether it was genuine spiritual contact, or simply his subconscious providing the comfort he needed, Paul couldn't say. But John's voice seemed real, seemed present, seemed to be engaging with the music Paul was creating. "It's beautiful, Paul. Sad as hell, but beautiful. You always were better at the pretty melodies. I was the one with the edge. You were the one with the heart." "Don't," Paul said aloud, his voice thick with tears. "Don't make jokes. Not now. I can't handle your humor right now." "When else am I going to make jokes? I'm dead, mate. If I can't make jokes about that, what's the point of being a ghost?" Paul laughed despite himself, a sound that was half sob, half genuine amusement. And suddenly the song felt less like a funeral dirge and more like a conversation. The kind of conversation they used to have when they were writing together, challenging each other, building on each other's ideas, creating something neither could have imagined alone. "You know what the real tragedy is?" the imaginary John continued, his voice taking on the philosophical tone he'd sometimes adopted during their deepest discussions. "We had 40 years of music left to make together. 40 years of arguments about chord changes and arrangements. 40 years of making each other better, of pushing each other to places we never could have gone alone." "I know," Paul whispered. his hands moving automatically across the keys. I think about that every day. All the songs we'll never write, all the harmonies we'll never find, all the stupid arguments about whether a bridge should go up or down, fast or slow. But you're not dead, Paul. You've still got music to make. Different music, maybe. Sadder music, more honest music, but still music. And every song you write from now on will carry a little bit of our partnership in it, because that's what we gave each other. A way of hearing music that we'll never lose, even when we're apart. Paul worked on the song until dawn, crafting verses that captured both his love for John and his regret about their unfinished relationship. Each line was a small confession, each melody a memory, each harmony an attempt to recreate the musical conversation that had defined his creative life. The final lyric came to him as the sun was rising. How do I carry on without you here? I guess I'll have to learn to let you go. But I don't want to let you go, Paul said to the empty room, his voice barely a whisper. Letting you go feels like killing you all over again. Feels like admitting that everything we built together was just temporary, just a phase in our lives, instead of the defining relationship I thought it was. This time, the imaginary John's voice was gentler, more like the friend Paul remembered from their early days. You're not letting me go, Paul. You're letting me live in the music. Every time you play this song, every time someone hears it and feels something, I'm here. Not dead John, not tragic John, just John who loved making music with his friend Paul. Paul played the song through from beginning to end, and for the first time since December 8th, 1980, he felt something that wasn't pure pain. Not happiness, not peace, but something like acceptance, the recognition that grief could coexist with gratitude, that loss could somehow, impossibly, become a form of love. Without thinking about it, Paul had been recording everything throughout the night. The conversations, the tears, the gradual emergence of the song, the imaginary responses from John. 7 hours of the most intimate musical experience of his life, captured on tape in his home studio. The recording equipment had been running automatically, preserving every moment of his breakdown and breakthrough. When he finally stopped playing, as the winter sun streamed through the studio windows, Paul realized what he'd created wasn't just a song. It was a documentary of grief, a real-time recording of how an artist processes devastating loss through the only language he truly speaks, music. But it was too personal to share. The conversations with imaginary John, the breakdowns, the raw vulnerability, the desperate attempt to resurrect his dead partner through songwriting. It felt like releasing footage of a private funeral, like exposing the most sacred moments of his emotional life to public consumption. Paul carefully labeled the tapes "Personal, Not for Release," PM, and locked them in his archive, next to other recordings too intimate for the world. Early demos with Linda, recordings of his children learning to play instruments, musical experiments that had never been intended for anyone's ears but his own. For 37 years, those tapes remained sealed, a secret between Paul and the memory of John Lennon, a private conversation preserved in magnetic particles and silence.